Jim Ward, and I'm a certified SOLIDWORKS PDM professional technical support specialist with GoEngineer. In this video, I will be discussing setting up a workflow with both a major and a minor revision. First, let's look at the requirements of the workflow. Now, anytime you do a workflow, there must be a reason behind the workflow. What is it that you wish to accomplish? So in this case, we realized that sometimes there are changes that apply only to the drawing. For an example, we may have a dimension that was missed, or a note needs to be changed in the drawing. It really doesn't affect the model. And therefore, we would like to change the drawing and track those changes by doing only a minor revision change. Therefore, only the drawing will be allowed to go through the minor revision path. Now, as far as the revision itself, with the major minor, the major component will be in alpha components, like an A, B, C. And then for the drawing, when it goes through a minor revision, it will be numeric. So it will go like a 1, 2, and 3, etc. So when first released, the revision will only show the alpha component. That'll be true for both the drawing and the model. The numeric component will only show on drawings should they need to have a minor change. So if they don't show a change, then they don't show any numerics after them. Models, of course, will only have the major component. When a drawing is initially released, it will show only the major component, A, B, C. There's no 0 or 1 or anything after that. However, if it does need a minor change, then it will show the minor component as well. So as an example, we have a drawing. It's been released to revision C. We discover there's a problem. There was a dimension that was missed. Therefore, we put it through again, fix that dimension, and we re-release it to the minor workflow, but now it goes to C1 to show that it has been revised. If any other issues are found, the revision will move on to C2 and C3, and etc. like that. Now, when both the drawing and the model are next released, the drawing will go from, say, C3 to revision D, again with no numerics after it. And then in PDM, there is an option in Windows Explorer to set revision. And we want that to work for the major components. This set revision is particularly useful should we have legacy files that are currently outside of ePDM and they need to be brought in to PDM, but not start over again at revision A, but to be brought in at the revision that they are currently released, perhaps revision F or something later. So workflow creation steps. Well, the first thing we need to do is create the major minor revision. And then that can be broken down into creating the alpha component, creating the numeric component, and then combining them into a major minor revision. So to do that, let's pull up our admin tool. Now, if we look, we already have the alpha component set. It's called alpha. We set the initial counter value, but in this case, we're just using the format string and we're using the alphabet with all capitals, A, B, C, etc. Now what we need to do is to also add a numeric component. And to do that, we will say new component, and we will say numeric. And in this case, we're going to do a value from list. And the reason for that is because the first one I want to be blank. After that, I want it to go from 1, 2, 3. If we don't make it blank in the beginning, then when first released, it will have to have some digit. I'll go up to 10. If you need more than 10, you can always come back and add them later. Now, when we have a list, we need to know what to do when we run out of the end of the list. So we're going to say refuse the operation and an email to management so that they're notified that someone needs to come in and expand the list. So I'll say OK, and now we see in the revision number components we have both then the alpha and the numeric. So the next step, we've created the alpha component, we now have the numeric component. Now we need to combine them into an actual revision number. So to do that, we'll do a new revision number. I'm going to call this major minor. Now the format string is going to be quite simple. It's going to be the alpha followed by the numeric with nothing in between. I will say OK. And now we have the revision number, major, minor. The next thing that we need to do is to create the workflow. And the workflow, within the workflow, we'll be doing several things. First, we'll start by creating states. Then we create the transitions between those states. And then next, we decide where we want the revisions to be incremented. And then we set the revision increments between the major and the minor. We set the transition actions to do that. We set the transition conditions for drawings. And finally, we set properties of all workflows to determine when files will enter this workflow. You have to realize that we have multiple workflows within the vault. And so within the properties of the workflow is how we determine which workflow files will go into when they're added to the vault. Our next step is to actually create the major minor workflow. So we will do that by right-clicking Workflows and choose New Workflow. We'll call it Major Minor. If you like, you can add a description. We do have to tell PDM when does a file enter this workflow. In this case, I created a special folder so that anything that goes into the major minor folder will be entered into this workflow. So in this case, I will add a new condition. This will be a file path. The argument is the wildcard %, the backslash. The backslash helps to tell PDM that this is a folder, the backslash is, and the last is %, which means anything that goes in that folder will be able to go into this workflow. I'll say OK, and it creates the workflow, and it creates a beginning state, which is called initiated by default. Now we will edit this. I'm going to call this a work in progress. And for purposes of this video, the permissions I'm going to leave alone because it gets too complex to go into permissions at this point. We're just going to name this one work in progress and leave it as the initial state. So now when a file goes into this workflow, it will be entered in this state, the work in progress state. The next step is to add some more states. So we know we're going to need a released state. By the way, permissions in PDM are controlled by state and by location or by folder. And so you can go into the different states and determine who can do what in each state. At the moment, I'm just going to do the released state. Now, the released state is where we want revision numbers to be incremented. So I'm going to choose the major minor, and it is tied to a variable. In our case, we're going to use the revision variable. So we choose that. If we don't choose that, then it does not update the variable. The variable is what is used to show the actual revision value in the file data card. And when you're viewing it within the files, what shows on drawings, that's all determined by the revision variable. The actual revision is internal to PDM, and I will show you how to look at that a little bit later. But for now, we know that we want, this is going to be the major portion. It will increment by 1, and the numeric value will be reset regardless of what it was before. It's going to counter is going to be reset to 1. Right? We say OK. The next step is to put in a, for the major workflow, when they start with work in progress, in order to get to released, do we want them to go straight to released, or do we want them to go through an approval step first? I'm going to say for the major, yes, we do want them to go to approval first. So again, I'm going to say awaiting approval. There's no revision numbers because they may not be approved. So I'll say OK. Now I can move these around wherever I like. And now comes the transition. So the initial transition for the major release, it's a new transition. It's going to go from work in progress to awaiting approval. And I'm going to say submit for approval. And this is what you would see when you right click and you're ready to change state. I will say OK, and you can position these however you like. I have to kind of move them off to the side, line them up. This one I'll bring up from the top. There, submit for approval. The next step is to go from approval to released. Let's say the file was good. New transition. Waiting approval to released. I'll just call this one approved. Now this is where we decide what happens. So the actions, we're going to add an action. The first thing that you need to do is to update the revision variable. If you don't do this, then in the folder data card and other locations, it won't show the proper revision. So we're going to update the revision variable. The action we're going to do is set variable, and here we tell it which variable, and it is revision. Now we have to tell it what the revision is going to be, and we're going to set that to the next revision. The next action that we need is to increment the actual revision. In this case, since we have both a major and a minor, I want to put a note here that I'm going to increment the major revision. If you like, you can enter a revision comment, up to you. I'm going to say OK, and we're good. So if it has gone through the approval process, it is ready for release. It goes into released. Of course, you need the return paths. Okay. Now, the last thing that we need to handle is the minor release. Now, the minor release does not have to go through the approval loop. It's going to be what we call a self-release. So this transition goes directly from work in progress to released, the minor release. Now, there is a condition here because we only want to allow drawings to go through this. Now, to specify that, we will say file path and text contains SLD-DRW. Well, let's even put a dot in front of that, so we know that it is an extension. And therefore, if the name has a .SLD-DRW, then it will be allowed to go through this workflow. If it doesn't have that, then it cannot go through. Now the actions, again, we need to do those same two actions. We need to update the variable. And the value again will be the next revision. We need to add another action to actually increment the minor revision. We're going to do that here, increment revision. Now, if you'd like, you can just put it in here as well, only run for files with extensions SLD-DRW. We've already set that. This is kind of doing the same thing, where it says only allow files with the SLD-DRW extension. Now there is one more thing that we need to do, and that deals with setting the counter on the revision numbers. But right now they don't show up. So I'm going to say OK. Now they will show up once we save this. So let's do that. And now let's save this. Now as the workflow is saved, let's go back to this minor release and edit the revision numbers. So now the major, the alpha component, we don't want to increment at all. So I'm going to put down increment by 0. The numeric, we want that to increment, therefore we will increment by 1. I'll say OK. and save this. Now that is our workflow. The next step is to test the workflow, and let's validate that it actually works as expected. Let's start with these two, this one and this one. Now drawing it apart, I'm just going to drag and drop them in. Now the first question is, did they go, well, of course I haven't checked them in yet, so let's do that. So they checked in. The first question is, did they go into the workflow? To find that out, you click on the version tab and you look down here on workflow. It says workflow is MajorMinor. So yes, they went into the workflow as expected, as we wanted them to. So they went into the initial work in progress state, so that is to be expected. Now notice the revision that's listed here is a dash and a D. Now we haven't actually released these files yet. So, these revisions are not accurate. Now, how do you tell? Well, if you right-click a file and go to its history, you can see if it has been released before. And you can see up here it has not been released. I'll show you again in a few minutes what it looks like when it has been. Now select these guys, change state, and we're going to submit for approval. You can add a comment if you like. In my case, I'm not. So they are awaiting approval. The next step is to actually release them. So we will change state, say approved, and now they should go to revision A, and they do. So when can you trust the revision that's listed in the column here and in the file data card? And the answer is, well, pretty much when it's in the released state. Because normally when it's released, we don't allow anyone to edit a file that's in the released state. And therefore, when it goes through the revision process, it goes to released, and the revision gets set, and it should stay that way unless somebody moves it into a different state in order to edit it. Now that it has been released, let's go look at the history. In the history, you can see revision A. And this is how you can tell what it will move to next. Because after revision A, it will move on to revision B, etc. So now we have released this to revision A. We look at the drawing and we say, well, wait a minute, I missed a dimension. So let's put it back to work in progress. Open it up, I make the change in the drawing. Now I'm ready to change state and go to a minor release. Say OK. Notice on this one, for the part, it says conditions for transition were not met. And you cannot check that. That's because we have specified that this is only for drawings. So now the drawing has gone to the released state at revision A1, and it's incrementing properly. It's the way we wanted. So now we have, let's see, we're done with this. Now we want to release both of these onto revision B. Let me take the drawing back to WIP. And I release both of them. They should both go to revision B. Well, actually, we have to submit for approval first because this is a major release. Waiting approval. They've been approved. Now we change state and approve them. Now they go to revision B. In testing the workflow, we have indeed verified that the model starts off at A, moves on to B, and that it cannot enter the minor revision path. We have looked at the drawing, released it at A, then released it through a minor revision to A1, and then when we re-released it, it did move on to B as it went through the major release path. Our next step would be to verify that file revisions can be set to the data card value. So let's go do that. For this next part, I have dropped a file into the vault that's already at revision D. At least that's what the file data card says. That's what the revision here says. But if we look at it, look at the history, we'll see that all I've done is I have dropped it into the vault, and it has really never been released within the vault. So how do we release this file and have it go to revision D? In order to release this file and have it go directly to revision D, we need to make a little change in our workflow. The first thing that we need is we need a transition that goes from work in progress directly to released, similar to the minor release, except this time we don't actually make any changes to the revision. So I'm going to call this an import. And normally you would limit this so that only a few people can take this path. And up here, import with no revision. And we're not going to do any actions. We're not going to change any revision numbers. We're not going to do any of that. I'm going to say OK and save the workflow. If you don't save the workflow, then you can't see any changes. Now, let's go to our part, right-click this, and do a check-in. We do have to check it in. Now we'll do the change state. And this time we want to import with no revision. So now that brings the solid part file to the released state, but it did not change the revision variable. And if you look at the history, you'll see that it made no changes here. All it did was change the state from work in progress to released. So now what we want to do is we want to select the file and go to Modify, Set Revision. Now right now there's only one file, and you could go through and set new revision on each one. And we do, by the way, we do want to update the variable, so you click that. But if you have many of these, one of the things you can do is select all of them and then do a right click and say set all new revision values to card variable value. If I do that, the new revision becomes the same value as what's in the file data card. And then for comment, you can say initial import to PDM, say that this is the first time it has been released in PDM. Tell it OK. And now when you go and you look at the history, we can see that the file has indeed been released at revision D internal to EPDM. This has been Jim Ward with GoEngineer discussing how to create a major-minor workflow in PDM Professional. I do hope that you have enjoyed this video.